Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we are going to unpack one of the most fascinating and honestly most urgent demographic mysteries of our time. I want you to imagine a highly developed, incredibly wealthy nation, a place that practically pays its citizens to have babies. We're talking substantial financial grants, extended parental leave, even priority access to housing just for young families. With all those perks, you would think the maternity wards would be absolutely overflowing, right? But they aren't. Instead, this country is rapidly running out of children. Today, we're focusing on Singapore, and we're going to uncover the hidden societal force driving this crisis. And spoiler alert, it actually has very little to do with money and absolutely everything to do with how we choose our partners.
Look at this number right here, 0.87. This is Singapore's projected total fertility rate for the year 2025. And guys, this is a historic, unprecedented low. To put this into perspective, for a population to just simply sustain itself without relying heavily on immigration, it needs a replacement rate of 2.1. At 0.87, that means the average couple in Singapore is having fewer than one child over their entire lifetime. Actually, scratch that. It's not just a statistical dip. This is a literal existential challenge for the future of the city-state. We're looking at a rapidly aging population, a shrinking workforce, and some really profound economic implications down the line.
The sheer speed of this decline is what has really set the alarm bells ringing. In 2023, the total fertility rate fell below 1.0 for the very first time. By 2025, it plunged to that staggering 0.87. Recognizing the absolute gravity of this freefall, the Singapore government realized they had to act, announcing the formation of a special interagency marriage and parenthood reset workgroup in April 2026. And look, this isn't your standard run-of-the-mill policy committee. Chaired by Minister Indranee Rajah, this group was formed with the stark realization that they must look way beyond traditional government policies. They have to start examining the intangibles, things like societal mindsets, workplace cultures, and the deeply, deeply personal expectations we all hold about marriage.
Now, for decades, Singapore has utilized what we call pro-natalist policies. Essentially, they threw the kitchen sink at the problem. The baby bonus scheme literally hands direct cash to parents. They've extended parental leave time and time again. They even give young couples priority access to the country's highly coveted public housing system. But all these financial and logistical incentives, they've ultimately failed to reverse the downward trajectory. And you have to ask yourself why. Well, because as the new work group noted, the root issue isn't purely economic. It's incredibly personal. It is totally intertwined with people's core values, their life goals, and their fundamental attitudes toward the institution of marriage itself.
Which brings us directly to the hidden culprit behind the data. We are going to transition now to look at a structural misalignment in the modern marriage market. It's an uncomfortable truth, one that often gets completely left out of mainstream policy discussions, but it is absolutely central to understanding this crisis. We are talking about the mating gap.
To really grasp the mating gap, we first have to understand this core concept right here, female hypergamy. Historically, across so many different cultures, hypergamy, which is the practice of a person marrying a spouse of higher caste, higher education, or greater wealth, has been a dominant mating strategy. In Singapore, this manifests as a deep-seated, often unspoken social expectation that women should marry up. You know the script. They are expected to seek partners who are at least equal to, if not vastly superior to, themselves when it comes to educational credentials, income, and overall social status. But there is a massive structural problem when this traditional expectation suddenly clashes with modern reality.
Let's move to and see how this builds, because look at this educational asymmetry. Over the past few decades, the demographic reality in Singapore has shifted entirely. Women now significantly outpace men in higher education. In 2021, 64% of women aged 25 to 34 held a university degree. But in that exact same age cohort, only 56% of men had one. So think about the math here. If a highly educated woman is holding on to that old societal script that she absolutely must marry up or at the very least marry an equal, the mathematical pool of traditionally qualified men is shrinking rapidly. It's like a giant game of musical chairs, but the chairs are disappearing.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how stubborn these expectations remain, despite the changing math. In a 2022 survey by the dating agency Lunch Actually, single men and women were asked about their willingness to date outside those traditional financial norms. A massive 92% of men said, "Sure, I'm perfectly willing to date a woman who earns more than me." But for women, only 42% were willing to date a man who earned less. Think about that. That is a 50 percentage point disparity. It highlights this incredibly rigid barrier to marriage. The societal expectations simply haven't evolved to match the brand new educational and economic landscape.
And here is the real human impact of this mismatch. This data from the Singapore Department of Statistics shows exactly who gets left behind in this scenario. Look at singles in their 40s. Men with below secondary school education have a singlehood rate of 24.5%, which is way above the age group average. Meanwhile, highly educated, university-credentialed women have a singlehood rate of 18.8%, also well above average. What's happening here is honestly quite tragic. Both of these groups deeply desire marriage and a family, but they are trapped by a social script that completely prices them out of the market. High-earning women are competing fiercely for a tiny fraction of men, while lower-educated men are almost entirely overlooked.
Now, this mating gap isn't just causing higher singlehood rates, it is actively and profoundly reshaping women's medical choices and their entire reproductive timelines. Let's pivot to a trend that has garnered massive media attention globally, but is so often completely misunderstood: elective egg freezing. So, the crucial point is captured perfectly in this quote from Professor Marcia C. Inhorn, a medical anthropologist at Yale University who extensively researched this exact phenomenon. You see, there's this popular, almost punitive narrative out there that women freeze their eggs because of selfish career ambitions, that they're putting corner offices before cribs. Well, Inhorn's research of 150 women proved the exact opposite. These highly educated, professionally successful women weren't freezing their eggs to climb the corporate ladder. They were doing it because they were facing a severe, critical shortage of men who were, in her words, eligible, educated, and equal.
Singapore recently recognized this shifting reality on the ground. Believe it or not, prior to 2023, elective egg freezing was actually banned in the country. But in 2023, the ban was officially lifted for women aged 21 to 37. Now, while this policy shift is an absolute major win for reproductive autonomy, allowing women to preserve their chances of biological motherhood as their natural fertility declines, it's essential we view it in the right context. These women aren't cautionary tales of excessive female ambition. Rather, egg freezing is essentially a symptom of this widening marriage gap that society has been so hesitant to confront. They are quite literally buying time, just hoping the marriage market catches up to them.
So, why is this happening? Why do these hypergamous expectations remain so stubbornly ingrained in Singapore, even when women are clearly outperforming men academically? Well, to understand that, we have to look at the profound socio-cultural environment. It's a really unique, potent mix of ancient traditions and modern hyper-competition.
Singapore's societal fabric is heavily influenced by its broader East Asian identity, which is deeply rooted in Confucian values. Traditionally, this ideology places the man as the unequivocal head of the household and the primary breadwinner, while relegating women to a more subordinate, caregiving role. Now, modern Singaporean women have achieved remarkable professional parity, no doubt about it, but that cultural legacy? It lingers. There is still a significant, very real social stigma attached to a woman out-earning her husband, or a man taking on the role of a stay-at-home dad. It's that underlying peer pressure that keeps the old rules firmly in place. Compounding all of this is a famous local concept called kiasu. It literally translates from Hokkien to the fear of losing out. Now, Singapore is a hyper-competitive, highly meritocratic society, and this kiasu mentality permeates absolutely everything. We're talking from getting your kid into an elite primary school all the way up to advancing in your own career. In a culture that intensely glorifies credentials, failing to marry well can cause a profound shame-based loss of face for a family. Educational certificates and paychecks essentially become proxies for a partner's actual character and worth. And because kiasu drives this intense education fever, with parents spending heavily on private tuition and enrichment classes to ensure their child's success, the sheer financial burden of raising a child becomes immense. That massive cost heavily incentivizes women to seek high-earning husbands simply to secure the necessary resources for their future offspring.
But hey, it's not just culture at play here. We need to shift gears for a second and look at the deep evolutionary roots of these behaviors. The preference for female hypergamy is not merely a modern sociological quirk caused by competitive schooling. It is actually hardwired into our biology.
The foundational framework for this is called parental investment theory, formulated by evolutionary biologist Robert Trivers back in 1972. The theory states that the sex that invests more time, energy, and resources into producing and raising offspring will naturally be much more selective in choosing a mate. In humans, females bear a massive biological burden. You've got gestation, the risks of childbirth, and lactation. Because of this heavy upfront investment, evolutionary psychology suggests that females evolve to preferentially select mates who demonstrate the clear ability and willingness to provide long-term resources and protection. It's literally survival of the fittest in action.
And this brilliantly illustrates how those evolutionary drives translate to our modern world. In the animal kingdom, resource signaling is super obvious. A female bowerbird chooses a mate based on the male's ability to construct an elaborate, resource-rich nest, which signals his genetic quality. A peahen looks at the extravagant feathers of a peacock to judge his health and vitality. For modern humans, particularly before women had widespread economic independence, physical stature and wealth were those signals. Today, even though women in Singapore are highly financially self-sufficient, those ancient psychological mechanisms, they're still running in the background like old software. Modern financial credentials, university degrees, fat paychecks, fancy job titles, are quite literally the human equivalent of the bowerbird's nest.
So, if we are fighting both deeply ingrained cultural shame and ancient evolutionary biology, how on earth does a country reverse a 0.87 fertility rate? It requires a fundamental, ground-up reset of the marriage script. We are now going to transition to the solution phase, looking at exactly what the interagency work group and society at large absolutely must do to fix this.
The necessary societal cure involves normalizing a concept called educational hypogamy. This is the exact opposite of hypergamy. These are marriages where the wife is more educated or earns more than her husband. If we look at Nordic countries like Sweden and Denmark, which by the way boast relatively higher and much more stable fertility rates, we see that they have successfully normalized hypogamy. In these countries, a successful marriage doesn't rely on the man being the status-dominant provider. Instead, couples organize their families around shared values, mutual respect, and a true egalitarian partnership.
And here is the clear blueprint for that societal change. First, Singapore absolutely must normalize these mixed-collar and hypogamous marriages. Second, and I think perhaps most importantly, we have to completely redefine male worth. A man who is kind, emotionally intelligent, and a dedicated co-parent is not an inferior partner just because he doesn't have a master's degree or a massive paycheck. Third, workplaces must actively support dual-income, equal caregiving family models. This completely alleviates the crushing pressure on men to be the sole providers. And finally, society must reevaluate the Kiasu-driven education arms race, broadening the definition of success so the financial threshold for starting a family isn't so terrifyingly high.
This number, 10, represents a very promising start. It stands for the newly enhanced 10-week shared parental leave recently introduced in Singapore. This is a vital, structural step forward. Policies exactly like this are essential for reducing the stigma placed on stay-at-home fathers and actively encouraging men to step into equal caregiving roles. When a woman knows for sure that her partner will truly share the domestic load, the rigid necessity of marrying a higher-earning provider naturally diminishes. It levels the playing field. Which leaves us with this final thought. We've seen the data, we've explored the biology, and we've unpacked the cultural expectations that are quite literally preventing an entire generation from starting families. The government can provide all the housing grants and parental leave in the world, but legislative measures alone cannot solve a cultural mismatch. Reversing this demographic decline requires real courage from individuals to challenge those inherited assumptions. So I leave you with this. If a university degree doesn't make someone a kinder, more reliable, or better co-parent, is it time we stopped letting a piece of paper dictate who we spend our lives with? Think about it. Thank you so much for joining this explainer, and we'll see you next time.